The Triple Crown of motorsport is made up of the three most famous, grueling, difficult and dangerous races on the planet. The Monaco Grand Prix, Formula One's Jewel in the Crown and the original F1 street race. 2 miles around the Principality of Monaco, where the slightest mistake will see you add your name to the long list of drivers who have met Monaco's barriers. The Indy 500, also known as the greatest spectacle in racing, 500 miles around the most famous oval track in the world, where 100% of the lap is taken at full throttle, never more than a moment away from disaster. And the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the oldest active endurance race in the world around the 8-mile circuit mixing track and public roads, where teams use multiple drivers to master the track over the course of 24 hours, and again, disaster never too far away. All of these races have been won by some of the most legendary names in motorsport history. But there is only one man who has won all three, and this is his story. This is Graham Hill, taking the Triple Crown. On February 15th, 1929, Graham Hill would be born in London to a suburban middle-class family, his father working on the stock exchange. He developed a love of Meccano as a child and learning how things worked. When Hill was 10 years old, the Second World War began, and he had clear memories of watching dogfights take place in the skies of London. One night he was awoken by a large boom, which completely shook the house, smashed the windows and slammed all the doors, as a bomb had fallen just a mile away, and he would be evacuated to Hereford, as many children who lived in the cities were. After the war, he would return to London and attend Hendon Secondary School, then on to Hendon Technical Institute to study engineering. It was also around this time he would have a crash on his motorbike after hitting an abandoned car left in the middle of the road with no lights on in the fog. He would be hospitalised for 3 months and was left with a permanent bend in his left leg. At age 21, he joined the Royal Navy as part of his national service and served on the HMS Swiftsure. During this time, he did a tour of the Mediterranean, where he would visit Monaco for the first time. After the national service, he would return home and take up a job at Smith's Alarm Clocks, but struggled to live a normal life, knowing his life in the Navy and knowing places like Monaco were out there. At age 24, Graham Hill would drive a car for the first time, learning to drive in a Morris 8. And around the same time, he would see an advert to drive a Formula 3 car around Brands Hatch, all for just 5 shillings a lap, which is approximately £8 in modern money, and this is when he would fall in love with racing. In a quest to follow his newfound love, Hill would meet Gordon Thornton, who was starting a racing school. Hill offered to help out as a mechanic in exchange for lessons, and hopefully a race seat, and Gordon agreed. Graham would quit his job and live off the dole while looking after the F3 cars. Then one day, he turned up and Gordon Thornton, the cars, and everyone else he'd worked with at the club had all completely disappeared, and Hill would never see them again. But even this would not put Graham Hill off, and he found a new club, the Premier Motor Racing Club, and offered the same deal, his services as a mechanic in exchange for entry to the club and a possibility of driving. And this time, that possibility actually happened. On the 27th of April 1954, Graham Hill made his racing debut in a Formula 3 race. Hill was very nervous about the start, so decided to go all out to make sure he didn't make any mistakes. When the flag fell, he shot into first place and was so shocked he thought he must have made a mistake. He would eventually finish second in the heat and then fourth in the final. At a different race, Hill's engine died and he stormed back to the paddock, where he would meet Colin Chapman. They would share a lift to London and Graham Hill would offer to repair one of Chapman's cars that had been damaged in a previous race. After this, Hill and Chapman formed a bond and a working relationship, where Chapman paid Hill a grand total of £1 a day to work for his team, which became known as Team Lotus. Another passion of Hill's life was rowing from the time in the Navy. He would join the Oriel Rowing Club in Hammersmith, where he would meet his future wife, Betty Shoebrook. He then went on to join the London Rowing Club, and their hat design with the dark blue background and white arrows would be the inspiration for Hill's racing helmet. He would also go on to win the first 8 in the Henley Regatta with the London Rowing Club, and Hill also credits rowing as giving him a never say die attitude, which would be incredibly evident in his F1 career. Graham and Betty were on and off a lot as a couple. At this time, Graham was not interested in getting married and Betty very much was. At one point they separated and Betty met a Canadian naval lieutenant who was studying at Greenwich Naval College, and they started seeing each other, and she planned to move back to Canada with him. When Hill heard about this, he went round to her house and proposed, saying, "I don't want you to go, marry me." And the two were married 2 months later. They took their honeymoon in Bognor Regis, not too far away from the Goodwood circuit, so Graham could compete in a 9-hour race. They didn't have much money at the time and life was tough as Hill followed his racing dreams. They lived in a flat with a bathroom they had to share with 9 other people. But in 1958, it would all pay off as Graham Hill made his F1 debut with Team Lotus. This would also be the debut of Team Lotus in Formula 1, and that would take place at the second race of the 1958 season, the Monaco Grand Prix, the same place Hill had visited with the Navy previously. 30 drivers entered qualifying, with only the top 16 actually going through to the race. Hill would qualify 15th and make it through. Of the names that didn't make it through were a young Bernie Eccleston. Hill would climb to 6th but eventually retired due to a cracked half shaft. After getting out of the car, he would completely collapse due to exhaustion, but would come round to spend some time in the casino, winning £120, which is the equivalent of £2,398 in today's money, his first big win in Monaco. He didn't hero worship any of the drivers, as he was never too interested in races he wasn't competing in, but he did have a great admiration for Juan Manuel Fangio. When asked if he ever raced against Fangio, he replied, "No, but I was once in the same race as him," which was the French Grand Prix of 1958, the only race the two of them shared, as this was Fangio's final Formula 1 race. Hill was such an admirer of Fangio that in his book he would go on to write this: "He was a tremendous driver and is now a marvellous ambassador for motorsport. He is still an international figure and gets recognised everywhere he goes. He turns up to Grand Prix unannounced, and when he walks down the pits, the crowd roars in the opposite stands and will stand up and cheer. One of my biggest regrets is that I can't speak Spanish, so I can't speak with him except through a translator. But it gives me great pride to say that I was once in the same race as Fangio, even if it does date me a little bit." Hill's first F1 year was not a successful one. In fact, Hill would retire from his first 6 races, 5 of them being retirements due to mechanical failures. But he would finally finish his first race at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. But even this was not straightforward, as he had to cope with a brakes failure, a fire, and 3 pit stops to refill the radiator with water. And even with all that, Hill's car ran out of fuel as he crossed the line in 6th, which at the time gave him no points. The final race of the year was the Moroccan Grand Prix, which was also a bad race, with Hill finishing 16th and being lapped 8 times by eventual winner Sterling Moss. But his fond memory from that race weekend came from outside the track. He wrote in his book, Life on the Limit, saying, "One of the things that sticks in my memory about the Moroccan GP was that we stayed in a very smart hotel, with self-opening doors. I had never encountered such doors up to that point, and I was frightfully impressed that the doors should fly open when you stood on the mat in front of them." 1958 hadn't gone well, and there was hope for 1959, but that went just as badly. The year started again in Monaco, where Hill would see a huge amount of smoke in his mirrors and thought somebody's car must be on fire, before realising it was him. He stopped the car and got out with the flames raging. He then realised that if the car was damaged in the fire, he wouldn't have a car for the next race, so ran back to the flaming car and searched the cockpit for the inbuilt fire extinguisher. He eventually found it, but when he pressed the button, nothing came out. A marshal then ran towards him with a bigger fire extinguisher, but then stopped at the car to start reading the instructions on the side. Hill snatched it from his hands and hit the big red button on the top, extinguishing the fire. This was the standard for Hill in 1959, with that being one of the 5 mechanical retirements from the 7 races he entered that year. And after 2 years of disappointment with Lotus, Hill decided it was time for him to look to other teams. The British Racing Motors, or BRM team, had been around in F1 since 1951, but would only do occasional races, as they would often fail to qualify, appearing in 5 races across 1951, 1956 and 1957. From the Monaco GP of 1958, BRM's fortunes would start to change, as they started to qualify for races consistently. Strangely, the same race that saw the debut of both Hill and Lotus. 1958 went well for BRM, with 2 podiums and finishing 4th in the Constructors, beating Maserati, who had powered Fangio to the title the year earlier. 1959 had been even better, with Joe Bonnier taking the first win for the team at the Dutch Grand Prix, and the team finishing 3rd in the Constructors in what was just their 2nd full-time season. Another bonus for the team was that they manufactured their own engines, and for 1960 they would have a new driver on their books, one Graham Hill. And as much as 1959 hadn't been a good year for Hill's professional career, it was a good one in his personal life, as he became a father for the first time, with his daughter Bridget Hill being born. After the first 2 races of the 1960 season, it seemed very much like it was new team, old news for Graham Hill, with 2 retirements from the first 2 races. Then, the Dutch Grand Prix would happen, where he would achieve his first ever podium. Meanwhile, at Lotus, they had a tough time replacing Hill. Firstly, they brought in Alberto Rodriguez Larreta, who impressed Colin Chapman, who offered Alberto a full-time contract, but it was turned down, as Alberto opted not to fully focus on Formula 1 and look at a variety of different motorsports. Lotus then turned to John Surtees for the 2nd race of the year, who was also very impressive, but was competing in F1 and on motorbikes at the same time, so was not able to be at every race, including the 3rd race of the year. So Lotus had to bring in a 3rd different Hill replacement in just 3 races. This time they turned to a young Scottish driver named Jim Clark, who we might hear more about later. Back with Hill, and that podium turned out to be a standalone result that year, with him retiring from every other race that season, even the British Grand Prix, where he retired from the lead of the race with only 6 laps to go.
Graham Hill soon caught and passed Brabham, a magnificent achievement after being left on the grid. But then, going into copse, passing slower cars, he threw it all away, spinning off into retirement, and thus giving Brabham his 4th Grand Prix victory in a row.
Meanwhile, Lotus did get their first win as a chassis supplier for Sterling Moss with the Rob Walker racing team, although Team Lotus would not have to wait too long for their own success. Meanwhile, away from the track, Graham would become a father for the 2nd time, this time to a baby boy who he named Damon. So far, Graham Hill's F1 career outside of one podium had not been successful, and 1961 was not about to turn that around, scoring just 3 points. BRM had had a fantastic first couple years in F1, but their 3rd and 4th seasons were nowhere near as successful. Alfred Owen, the owner of BRM, declared that if they did not get good results, he would end the team, and he also put Tony Rudd in charge as the new team principal to turn the team around. And turn the team around he did. The first good signs came at a non-championship race before the season began, the Glover Trophy at Goodwood, which Hill would win, although he was not the biggest news story coming out of that race. Hill was overtaking Sterling Moss for the lead when Moss's car had a mechanical failure, causing him to have a very scary crash. Thankfully, Moss survived the crash, but would be in a coma for a month, and after the crash would never race in Formula 1 again. While there had been no contact between Hill and Moss, Hill was incredibly worried that people would blame him for the crash, and he also felt the tremendous pressure with Moss retired that the hopes of the British fans were now on him, and a new generation of British drivers, including Jim Clark, John Surtees, Trevor Taylor and Innes Ireland.
Overtook Moss. Sterling had gone slap off the track. It may have been brake failure, but trapped in his car he received serious injuries. While he was being taken to hospital, the race continued at a scorching pace. Graham Hill in a BRM was the winner.
So heading into the 1962 season, the BRM team had great momentum, but they weren't the only ones. Team Lotus had got their first win thanks to Innis Island in the final race of 1961 at Watkins Glen. The first race of 1962 was the Dutch Grand Prix, and it saw the debut of the Lotus 25, a revolutionary design, which was the first in F1 to feature a monocoque chassis. Pole for the race would be taken by John Surtees, then Hill in second and Clark in third. Hill's car would get damaged on the lap to the grid, but he carried on and went to the race start, where Clark would take an early lead and pulled over a 20-second lead from Hill until he had clutch issues and fell back. Clark then pulled into the pits, handing the lead across to Hill, which he kept, and as the checkered flag came out, he crossed the line to take his first official F1 victory and giving him and BRM the early championship lead. Bruce McLaren would win the next race in Monaco, then Jim Clark would take his first win at the Belgian Grand Prix, then his second win 2 races later at the British Grand Prix. This would be the 5th race of the year, and with only 9 races in the season, the championship story was starting to form, and after the British GP, Hill was still leading the championship as he had been all season, but Jim Clark was just 1 point behind. The next race was the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, the 14-mile circuit in the Eifel Mountains. Heavy rain fell on the circuit before the morning of the race. There was a slight break in the rain for a couple of hours before the race started, but just as it was about to begin, the rain began to fall again, forcing them to delay by an hour. Dan Gurney sat on pole position with Hill in second and Jim Clark in third. As the race started, Clark had forgotten to turn on his fuel pumps and was left on the grid as his rivals pulled away. Gurney, Hill and Surtees fought for the lead, and on the third of the 15 laps, Hill would take the lead, but then would have to fight with all he had to keep it lap after lap around the wet Nürburgring. And after over 2.5 hours of racing, Hill would cross the line and win the race 2.5 seconds ahead of John Surtees, with Jim Clark finishing in 4th. He would make it back-to-back wins with a win at the Italian Grand Prix, which would also be the first 1-2 for BRM, with Richie Gunther finishing in 2nd.
Hill was driving magnificently, over 300 miles at over 120 miles an hour. This victory consolidates his lead for the world title. Pretty astonishing. Before this year, he'd never won a Grand Prix.
And Clark would win the penultimate race of the year at Watkins Glen, meaning as we went into the final race of the year, both drivers had 3 race wins, and Hill led the championship by 9 points, meaning that Clark would have to win the final race and Hill not score any points in order to win the championship. But it was a bit more complicated than that, as only the best 5 results counted toward the championship at the time. Going into the final race, Hill had scored points in 7 of the 8 races. His best 5 points were his 3 wins and 2 second places, so anything other than a win would not count towards his championship points tally, whereas Clark had only scored points 4 times in the season so far, so anything he did counted. So if Clark won and Hill came second, Clark would gain a total of 9 points and Hill would gain nothing, giving the title to Jim Clark. Going into the race, Hill was understandably incredibly nervous. He was interviewed before the race and asked, "What is it that bothers you on a day like this?" His response was, "People like you asking me questions like that." Jim Clark took pole by 3/10 of a second from Graham Hill. Clark got a good start and would lead the race and start to pull away until, on lap 26, when a bolt fell out of Clark's engine and caused an oil leak. He had to pull into the pits and retire the car, handing Hill not only the lead of the race, but also securing the World Championship for Graham Hill and for BRM.
Ominous cloud of smoke behind it. A small nut had come undone. A bolt had fallen out, allowing all the oil to come out. Clark had no option but to come into the pits and retire. Being the fine sportsman that he was first to congratulate Hill on winning the championship. Despite their disappointment, Chapman and Clark had made their point, and sooner or later all of the other manufacturers adopted the monocoque method of chassis construction.
Hill became just the second ever British World Champion, and BRM were the third British team to win the Constructors' Championship, but this was the first time ever a British driver had won a title with a British team. Hill had achieved his dream and reached the top of the Formula One world, and was now internationally famous. But he did struggle to see himself alongside some of the other great names that had come before him as world champion. At that time, he was only the 7th person to become Formula One world champion, and among those names was someone like Fangio, who, as we've already covered, Hill had the utmost respect and admiration for. Heading into the 1963 season, Hill is now the reigning champion, and it seems like the story of 1963 would be another Hill versus Clark battle. The first race of the year was Monaco. Clark would take a dominant pole by 7/10 over Hill in second, but in the race itself, Clark would get a bad start and fall to third, giving Hill the lead, and second place to Hill's teammate Richie Ginfer. Clark would get second place back on lap 5 and chase down Hill, and would then take the lead back on lap 17 and start to build with his tremendous pace. Meanwhile, Hill's car developed a small oil leak, which was strangely very beneficial to Hill, as the specks of oil would hit the goggles of John Surtees behind him whilst he would try and close in. On lap 78, Clark had gearbox issues and was out of the race, handing the race back to Hill. Hill would go on to break the lap record twice on the way to his first Monaco victory. This was also the second 1-2 for BRM, and a perfect start to the title defences of both Hill and the BRM team.
And Trevor Taylor rounding out the points. Graham Hill may have inherited the lead from the unfortunate Clark, but his speed had set a new race record. BRM team enjoyed the continuation of their 1962 successes.
Unfortunately though, this was a false dawn for Hill and BRM, as this season would not go their way. They would get one more win that year at Watkins Glen, which incidentally was BRM's third 1-2. But Jim Clark would take 7 wins, 7 poles and 9 podiums from the 10 races, leading 71.5% of the laps across the season. It was utter domination from Clark, who won the title by 25 points over Hill in second. At the time, this was the record for the most wins in a year, most poles in a year, most podiums in a year, most laps led in a year, and biggest gap between first and second in the championship. It may have taken a year longer than they wanted, but Jim Clark and Lotus had ironed out the mechanical issues of the Lotus 25 and had dominated the F1 world. 1964 got off to a similar start to 1963, with Hill taking his second win in a row at Monaco, with another 1-2 for the BRM team. But after that, it appeared that we had a repeat of 1963, with Jim Clark winning 3 of the next 4 races. At the halfway point of the season, Clark led the championship by 4 points from Hill, who again had shown incredible consistency, being the only driver to score points at every race to that point. There was a little under a month between the British and German Grand Prix, and this gave all the teams time to work on their cars before the second half of the season. And this time around, the sleeping lion of Formula One was to wake up. In the first decade of Formula One, Ferrari had powered 4 of the world champions, more than double what any other team had been able to achieve. And with Phil Hill's world title win in 1961, it looked like the Ferrari dominance would continue into the 1960s. But thanks to the rise of Lotus and BRM, it had reduced Ferrari to bit players where they were once superstars. 1962 was only their 3rd year without a win, and they finished 6th in the Constructors' Championship, which is still their 2nd worst championship result position to this day, and they won only one race in 1963 and finished 4th in the championship with less than half the points of Lotus. Going into 1964, Ferrari had John Surtees as their lead driver, who had hopped around different teams since being brought into F1 by Lotus to be one of the replacements for Graham Hill. Ferrari had had a revolving door on their second seat, but halfway through 1963 they settled on the Italian Lorenzo Bandini. At the halfway point of 1964, Surtees sat joint 6th in the championship on just 10 points, 20 points behind Jim Clark, and Ferrari were joint 4th in the Constructors, 24 points behind Lotus. Going into the German Grand Prix, Surtees would take pole by 0.4 of a second from Jim Clark. In the race itself, it was an all-out battle for the lead between Surtees, Clark, Hill and Gurney. Clark would again have car issues and fall back. Hill was also not able to keep up with the pace, leaving Surtees and Gurney to fight for the win. But eventually Gurney would run into engine issues and have to back off, leaving Surtees alone in the lead. Surtees would break the circuit record and would cross the line over a minute in the lead on the final lap from Graham Hill in 2nd place, as Gurney had fallen down to 10th with issues and Clark had to retire. Surtees jumped from 6th to 3rd in the championship after that race. Meanwhile, Hill's consistency meant that he was now the championship leader. During a test after the German Grand Prix, Hill would crash, which would leave him with a chipped bone in his neck, and he would have to wear an inflatable collar while racing for the next 6 months. Surtees would retire from the lead of the next race in Austria with a suspension issue, with the race eventually being won by his Ferrari teammate Bandini. This race also saw Graham Hill's first DNF of the year, and Jim Clark would also fail to finish that race. We then went to the home of Ferrari, Monza, and they put on a show where Surtees took pole by 0.8 of a second and came home to win the race by over a minute from Bruce McLaren in 2nd. Both Hill and Clark again would fail to finish this race. This gave Ferrari the lead of the Constructors' Championship. Hill would win the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen for the 2nd year in a row to put Ferrari's 3-race winning streak to an end, but John Surtees would finish 2nd. And despite changing cars after 40 laps of the race, Jim Clark still did not finish the race, retiring twice, which meant going into the final race of the year in Mexico, we had a 3-way title fight. Graham Hill led the championship on 39 points. John Surtees was now in 2nd on 34 points. Then retirements had again hampered Jim Clark, who was in 3rd, just hanging on to his championship hopes with 30 points. Again, Hill's consistency was being punished thanks to the rule that stated that only your best 6 results would count for this year. He had scored 41 points, but that was taking points in 7 different races so far. Only his 2 wins, 3 seconds and 4th place counted, so if he wanted more points, he would have to finish the Mexican Grand Prix higher than 4th. Whereas Surtees had already scored points 5 times and Clark only 4 times, so any points they scored in Mexico would count. Jim Clark would take pole for the Mexican Grand Prix by nearly a second, with Dan Gurney in 2nd. Then Bandini was the lead Ferrari in 3rd and Surtees in 4th. Clark's Lotus teammate Mike Spence was in 5th, then Graham Hill was in 6th, a joint lowest starting position of the season. It would get worse for Hill as well, whose goggle straps snapped as the race started, so he had to quickly get his spare goggles on and head off, and by the end of the first lap, Clark led with Hill down in 10th, and John Surtees was suffering a misfiring engine, which saw him down in 13th place. If the race was to end like that, Clark would take the championship, so Hill and Surtees had to fight their way through the field. By the halfway point of the race, Clark still led, Hill was 3rd and Surtees now in 5th. With this result, Hill would be crowned champion, although he was under pressure from Surtees' Ferrari teammate Bandini. When Bandini hit Hill and they both spun, Hill would make it back to the pits, then back out into the race, but his exhaust was bent, and this meant he was now out of contention, meaning his title hopes were now entirely in the hands of his 2 title competitors. Jim Clark led every lap of that race until lap 64 of 65, where the Lotus mechanical issues raised their ugly head once again, and Clark developed an oil leak, and as he started the final lap, the car gave up, and he was out of the race and out of the championship. With Clark out and Surtees in third, this meant that Hill was the champion, despite cruising around in 11th place, as Surtees needed to finish at least second to win the title. Ferrari knew this, and the man who was currently occupying second was Surtees' Ferrari teammate Bandini. As Bandini started his final lap, the Ferrari team frantically waved at him to slow down, and he got the message. And on the final lap of the final race of the year, Bandini moved aside, giving Surtees second place. And as he crossed the line, this was enough to become world champion by just 1 point over Graham Hill. Surtees becoming the first and so far only person to be world champion in both F1 and on motorbikes. Hill had scored a total of 41 points over the season, which would have been enough to see him clinch the title by 1 point. But this was from 7 races, and only the best 6 races counted, so his 2 points from the Belgian Grand Prix were taken away, meaning he lost the title by 1 point. After the race, Hill sent Bandini a book on the history of driving standards. Going into 1965, there was a big change for BRM, as Hill's teammate Richie Ginther, who had been part of the team since 1962, was replaced by a complete rookie. This rookie had been part of the Lotus F2 team, and had competed for Lotus in a non-championship race, after the final race of the season in 1964, where he had claimed pole but had to retire. BRM had been impressed with him and stole him right from Lotus to join BRM for 1965 to partner Graham Hill. This rookie's name was Jackie Stewart, who we might talk about more later on. The first race of 1965 was the South African Grand Prix and took place on New Year's Day. It was entirely dominated by Jim Clark, who got pole by nearly a second and led every lap and got fastest lap. It was the 6th Grand Slam for him, which meant he passed Alberto Ascari's record of 5 Grand Slams to put him number 1 of all time. He would eventually get 2 more to set a total of 8, which is still the record to this day. The next race was Monaco, where Hill had won the previous 2 years in a row, and it looked like he was in a good position to win it again, taking pole by 3 tenths from Jack Brabham in second, and his rookie teammate Jackie Stewart was in third. Off the start, Hill was able to keep the lead as Stewart jumped into second place. The 2 BRM cars started to pull away from the rest of the field, when on lap 25, Bob Anderson of the Brabham team suffered a drive shaft failure and stopped on the exit of the tunnel. As Hill and Stewart came out of the tunnel, they saw Anderson, although Hill saw him a little too late, and had to make avoiding action down an escape road as Stewart now led the Monaco Grand Prix.
Look out! That's Graham Hill, the leader, going down the escape route at the chicane.
In order to get the car back on track, Hill had to get out of the car and push it back onto the circuit before getting back in and carrying on. He was now down in 5th place. A couple laps later, Stewart had made a mistake coming out of Saint-Devote and span and fell down to 4th, with Hill just behind him. Stewart would wave his more experienced teammate through, allowing Hill to move up to 4th and chase the podium. Jack Brabham, who was now leading at this point, had an engine failure and limped back to the pits, promoting Hill to 3rd, and leaving the race as a Ferrari 1-2, with Bandini leading from Surtees. On the 53rd lap, Hill passed Surtees to take 2nd place, and all that stood between him and the win was the same driver who had hit him 2 races previously and cost him the world title, Lorenzo Bandini. And on lap 65, Hill made the move and retook the lead. 41 laps previously, he had been out of the car pushing it back on the track, and now he was leading again, and with incredible pace, breaking the circuit record multiple times. On lap 100, Hill crossed the line for the final time to take the checkered flag and win the Monaco GP for the 3rd time, and for the 3rd year in a row, matching Stirling Moss's record for the most Monaco GP wins. Many fans consider this to be Graham Hill's greatest hour, including himself, writing in his book that this was his greatest ever win. Although Hill's greatest win was slightly overshadowed. A couple drivers were not on the grid for the 1965 Monaco GP, one of whom was Jim Clark. That's because he was in America, taking part in a completely different race. That race was called the Indy 500. This was Clark's third attempt at the 500. He had finished second in 1963, and he'd got pole in 1964 but had to retire due to a suspension failure. But in 1965, he had qualified second and he had won it, leading 190 of the 200 laps of the race and winning by a gap of nearly 2 minutes, becoming only the second British driver to win the Indy 500 and the first non-American driver to win it in 49 years. Clark would return to Formula 1 for the next race and he would win it. Then he would win the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. In fact, the only race of the first 7 races of the F1 season Clark didn't win was the Monaco GP. Clark only finished 6 of the 10 races of the 1965 season, and he finished all of them in first place. Hill would win the US GP at Watkins Glen for the 3rd year in a row, and Jackie Stewart got his first win in his rookie year at the Italian Grand Prix, and Hill's former teammate would get his one and only win at the final race of the year, giving Honda their first win in a car which would go on to inspire a Red Bull livery 60 years later. But again, Hill would have to settle for second place to Jim Clark and Lotus, who had won the championship with 3 races to go, with Jackie Stewart taking 3rd in the championship in his first year.
New face here at our Sports Field Gathering. Jackie Stewart, the motor racing driver, had a great first season too in the big time.
Very pleasing, yes.
Now what about the old men, people like Hill and Clark?
Well, Hill's pretty old, but Clark's coming along. He's only 29.
You've travelled most of the way this season behind Jim Clark, Graham. What would you say is his most outstanding characteristic as a racing driver?
Well, I think getting across the line first. It's a bit irritating, actually.
Do you always know when he's behind you, Jim?
Yes, I can always recognise that moustache anywhere.
Well, gentlemen, look, seriously now, next year, change of formula, bigger engines. What does this mean to the firm of Hill and Clark?
Well, speaking as an old man, I'm rather looking forward to it. Jimmy, unfortunately, has got to use one of our engines, so just to show there's no ill feeling, I'm personally going to assemble his.
The 1966 season began with the Monaco GP, and for the first time in 4 years, Hill didn't win it, instead finishing 3rd with his teammate Jackie Stewart winning, meaning BRM had won it for 4 years in a row. But Hill had decided he wanted to try something a little different in the May of 1966. Hill had attempted to qualify for the Indy 500 in 1963, but crashed in practice and missed out on qualifying. So he entered the 1966 500 as a rookie. Hill wasn't even supposed to compete in 1966. The Mecum racing team had announced their drivers as Jackie Stewart, Roger Ward and Walt Hansgen. But after Hansgen's fatal crash during the test session at Le Mans, Hill was announced as a late replacement. Hill and Stewart were 2 of 7 rookies competing in the 50th Indy 500, and come qualifying, Mario Andretti would get pole, with Jim Clark in 2nd. Jackie Stewart was in 11th, and Hill was all the way down on the 5th row of the grid in 15th place. But little did they know, 1 lap later, your starting position would matter very little.
That's Andretti on the inside, Clark and the Miller, and Snyder on the outside, making their move for the lead. They gun it into the first turn. It looks like George Snyder may get the lead, but wait! Look back near the first turn. A massive upheaval of cars, tires flying in every direction. Look at the bumping, the smoke. Has to be one of the worst accidents ever here at Indianapolis.
16 cars were involved in a lap 1 crash, where 11 of the cars were taken out, and the red flag would come out to stop the race. Nearly an hour and a half later, the race would restart. Jim Clark and Lloyd Ruby would be the 2 drivers who dominated the opening half of the race. But Clark's reliability issues would now also spread to the Indy 500, as the car spun out of nowhere. Thankfully, Clark was able to continue the race, but he had handed the lead now to Jackie Stewart, where he led relatively comfortably until lap 191 of 200, where his engine failed and he was out of the race, allowing the lead to be handed to Graham Hill.
But where is Jackie Stewart, the leader? We haven't seen him for the moment from our vantage point. There he is. Jackie Stewart's car has stalled.
Who led the 200-lap race for only the final 10 laps before taking the checkered flag.
And there's the checkered flag, and it goes up for the first car to reach that point, Graham Hill. Jimmy Clark gets it next, then McElreath and John Cock.
Although it did seem like his win may have been taken away from him, as his celebrations were crashed by Colin Chapman and the Lotus team, who said that the results were incorrect, and Clark, who had spun twice, was actually a lap ahead of Hill. To which Hill replied, "No way, I've already drank the milk." The Lotus team launched an official protest of the results, but it was dismissed, and Hill was the winner of the race, meaning he was the second ever rookie to win and was given $156,000 prize money, which with inflation would be approximately $1.5 million today. Hill would use this money to buy his plane. In terms of results, the 1966 Formula 1 season was an uneventful one for Hill. The FIA had changed the rules around engine displacement, going from 1.5 litres to 3 litres. BRM had responded to these rules by creating a new engine bolting two V8s together and calling it the H16. It resulted in an engine that was not only incredibly heavy, but also did not have much power. Thankfully for BRM, Team Lotus also used the same engine, as Climax, their previous engine supplier, had left the sport. So both BRM and Lotus were slow that year, which allowed other teams to fill the gap at the top of the championship. Cooper found themselves back on top of the podium for the first time in 4 years. Ferrari made another brief return to the top after what had been a disappointing 1965. But the big winner was Brabham, and team owner / star driver Jack Brabham, who became the first and only team owner to win a world championship with his own team, after previously winning 2 titles with Cooper in 1959 and 1960. He was back on top in 1966 thanks to the Repco engine in the back of his car. But even if it was an uneventful season on the track, it turned out to be very eventful off track, with the new blockbuster film Grand Prix, directed by John Frankenheimer and starring James Garner. Graham Hill would make multiple appearances in this film, playing fictional racing driver Bob Turner.
It was an excellent race you did today, Jean-Pierre. Well done.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
The film would incorporate footage from the actual 1966 F1 season, including the incredibly eventful Belgian Grand Prix. The race was very wet, and 8 drivers didn't make it to the end of the first lap, including John Bonnier, who famously crashed into a window of a nearby house. Another driver who didn't make it to the end of the first lap was Jackie Stewart, who had a huge crash into a telegraph pole and was trapped in his car upside down with a split fuel tank pouring petrol on him. Hill saw the crash and pulled over to try and help his teammates with help from fellow driver Bob Bondurant. They flipped the car upright, but Stewart was still trapped by his steering wheel. Hill found a local and got a spanner to remove the wheel and free Stewart and carry him to safety, where the BRM car set alight moments after Stewart was placed in an ambulance. From that day forward, all BRM cars would have a spanner taped on the steering wheel, meaning the wheel could be easily removed in case of emergency. By the end of the season, Hill had beaten Clark in the championship for the 3rd time in 5 years, but unfortunately for both of them, they finished 5th and 6th, their first time outside of the top 3 since 1961. After the failure of BRM's 1966 engine, Hill decided it was time to move teams yet again, and this time he decided to return home, back to Lotus. The main reason being that Lotus had secured a new 3-litre Ford Cosworth DFV engine, DFV standing for double 4 valve. The Lotus team would be the first team to use the engine in Formula 1, and for that season they had an exclusivity deal. It would go on to become the most successful engine in F1 history. Debuting in 1967, it was still used in F1 in the early 80s. The engine would win 155 races and powered 12 drivers' titles and 10 constructors' titles. It is the only engine to complete the Triple Crown of Motorsport, winning in Monaco 11 times, Le Mans twice, and 10 times at the Indy 500. The added benefit of the Ford DFV was that it was cheap, coming in at £7,500, which made it far cheaper than trying to get a contract with any of the major teams like Ferrari, Honda, or BRM, meaning that the engine became the choice of the independent teams and allowed teams like Lotus, Tyrrell, Matra, Hesketh, Williams, and McLaren to go racing and even challenge the top teams. Hill joining Lotus also meant that he was now teammates with his longtime rival Jim Clark, and it looked like the fight for the championship would be between Hill and Clark going against the two Brabham drivers of Jack Brabham and Denny Hulme, although it was supposed to be. The typical Lotus reliability issues came back again. The Lotus had fantastic pace, taking 9 out of the 11 pole positions, 6 for Clark and 3 for Hill, but was only able to convert it into 4 wins, with Clark having 5 DNFs across the year and Hill having 8 DNFs, retiring from the lead 4 times and only finishing 3 races all year. From those 3 races, he finished 2nd twice and 4th once. Clark was able to win 4 races across the season, but it was not enough to stop the reliable Brabhams from taking the title, who had 4 DNFs all year between them. Denny Hulme would take the title with Jack Brabham in 2nd, Jim Clark in 3rd, and Hill's reliability issues forcing him to settle for 7th in the championship. Going into 1968, Jackie Stewart had also called it a day with the BRM team and joined the new Matra team. The team had only started 3 races prior to 1968, finishing in the highest position of 7th. But Stewart was not the only new part for Matra in 1968. They too now had a Ford DFV engine in the back of their car, with Lotus's exclusivity deal coming to an end at the end of 1967. And they had a new team principal, Ken Tyrrell. Tyrrell is often given the credit for discovering Jackie Stewart, as Stewart drove for Tyrrell's junior team in the early 60s, and after watching the Lotus team's success with the DFV, he persuaded Matra to back it, and also received backing from both Elf and Dunlop, and became Matra's team principal for 1968. The Lotus team arrived at the 1968 season looking exactly as they had at the end of 1967. Same drivers, same car. The only slight change was a slightly updated DFV in the back to try and help with these reliability woes. And it seemed to work well, with Clark taking pole and Hill in 2nd at the start of the South African Grand Prix, giving Lotus their 4th 1-2 in qualifying, all 4 of them being a combination of Jim Clark and Graham Hill. Stewart in the Matra was 3rd, beating the team's previous best qualifying position of 11th. When the race started, Stewart would shoot into the lead, but Clark would take it back on the 2nd lap. Ultimately, Clark would win the race with Graham Hill in 2nd, and Stewart would have to retire just after the halfway point with a broken connecting rod. There was over a 5-month gap between the 1st and 2nd race of the 1968 season, with the South African Grand Prix taking place on the 1st of January and the Spanish Grand Prix taking place on the 12th of May. In this time, many of the drivers competed at different categories, such as Formula 2. On the 7th of April, many F1 drivers, including Hill, Clark and Surtees, took part in an F2 race at Hockenheim. This was to be Jim Clark's final race. There was speculation as to if the crash had been a mechanical or driver error, with many of his fellow drivers stating that it had to have been a mechanical issue, as they did not believe Jim Clark could make an error. Hill wrote about Clark's death in his book, saying, "I don't think I really took in what happened. It was as if someone had told me it was a fine day. I heard what they said, but I didn't twig what it meant. It took a while to register that this was the last time we were going to see Jimmy." In his career, Jim Clark won 25 races, with the South African GP being his last win, meaning that he had overtaken Fangio's record of 24 wins at the time to put him number 1 of all time. He was also top of the record books for pole positions with 33, fastest laps with 28, laps led with 1,943, hat-tricks with 11, grand slams with 8, a record he still holds to this day. His 7 wins in the season record would not be broken until 25 years later, and that's when they had 6 more races in the season to break it. And his record of highest percentage of laps led in a season would stay for 60 years, until Max Verstappen broke it in 2023. And all of these records were set in just 9 seasons, and only ever driving for the Lotus team. To this day, he is the only world champion who won his final race, and when he died, he had easily secured himself into the debate of greatest of all time, which at the time was between himself and Fangio, with Fangio's only advantage being his 5 world title to Jim Clark's 2. And even Fangio himself had publicly said that Jim Clark was the greatest ever. Clark's greatest rival in his career was no doubt Graham Hill, the two fighting for multiple titles across multiple years, and ending their times together not only as teammates, but also as friends. Between the years of 1962 and 1965, for the only time in F1 history, 2 drivers were in the top 3 of the championship for 4 years in a row. Those 2 drivers were Graham Hill and Jim Clark, and in those 4 years, they won just over 75% of every F1 race held. In the aftermath of Clark's death, Colin Chapman contemplated disbanding the Lotus team altogether, but he was persuaded not to, and they entered the Spanish Grand Prix with only 1 driver, Graham Hill, although Chapman refused to attend the race, and it seemed like it would not be a good result for them either, after qualifying which saw Hill down in 6th, and he would fall down to 7th at the start of the race. But from lap 5, things would start to change. He passed McLaren to get back up to 6th, then Surtees to enter the top 5. Hill would pass Hulme for 4th, and then Beltois would suffer an engine issue and fall from the lead to the back. Hill chased down Rodriguez for 2nd, but Rodriguez would crash, giving the place to Hill, chasing down Amon for the lead, who was a massive 15 seconds ahead. But on lap 57, he would suffer a fuel pump issue and had to retire, giving the lead to Hill, who would cross the line to take his first win of the season and giving him the championship lead. Up next was Monaco. Hill would take pole by half a second, but wouldn't be able to keep the lead on the first lap, losing out to one of the Matras, who would keep the lead until lap 11, where they clapped the wall and was out of the race, giving the lead back to Hill. It would be a close race with Richard Atwood in the BRM not too far behind Hill, but he would not be able to pass, and Hill took a record-breaking 4th win in Monte Carlo, earning him the title, Mr. Monaco. So Graham Hill had the championship lead by 14 points over reigning champion Denny Hulme. But in the previous 2 races, there had been someone missing. Jackie Stewart had fractured his wrist during an F2 race and missed out on the Spanish and Monaco GP. But for the Belgian GP, he would make his return, where he would qualify 2nd and finish 4th to get his first points of the year. Then in the Netherlands in extreme wets, he would master the elements to take what was only his 3rd race win. And this one was with a margin of over a minute and a half to 2nd place. He would follow this up with a 3rd in France and a 6th in the British Grand Prix to make it 4 point scoring results in a row upon his return. Meanwhile, Graham Hill was having the opposite result, with 4 DNFs in a row and no points since his Monaco GP win. It meant that Hill was still a championship leader, but Jackie Ickx was now in 2nd, only 4 points behind, and Stewart was 3rd, 7 points behind, with reigning champion Denny Hulme 9 points behind going into the German GP. The 1968 German Grand Prix is famous for many reasons. Firstly, it was the first F1 race where a driver wore a full face helmet, Dan Gurney being that driver. But it was also famous for one of the greatest drives in F1 history, a beautiful display by the 29-year-old Jackie Stewart, who would once again master the elements in very heavy rain around the Nürburgring. Stewart was still suffering from pain in his wrists from the crash earlier that year, He lined up in 6th on the grid to start the race, but would not stay there for long. The memories of his crash that had almost cost him his life in a wet Spa a couple years previous still rang in his mind before the race, to the point that he did not want to compete, but was told by Ken Tyrrell to go out. A decision that Tyrrell later admitted he massively regretted, as he watched the race wondering if he had signed Stewart's death warrant. Stewart would make overtake after overtake on the first lap, driving into a wall of spray that came off the back of his rivals, until he came across Graham Hill, who was now in the lead. Stewart would make easy work of the Lotus driver and took the lead, and from there he would disappear at an average pace of 30 seconds per lap. After a grueling 2 hours and 20 minutes of racing, Stewart took the win from Graham Hill in second place, a gap of 4 minutes and 3 seconds between them. Stewart returned to the pits, and the first thing he asked Tyrrell was who died, to which Tyrrell informed him that none of his competitors had passed away during what had been a terrifying race. The win put Stewart second in the championship, just 4 points behind Hill with 4 races to go. Hulme would win the next 2 races in Italy and Canada, and Stewart would pick up another win at the US Grand Prix, which was the penultimate race of the year. So he entered the final race of the year in what was another 3-way title battle. This time, Hill versus Stewart versus Hulme. Hill led the championship on 39 points, with Stewart in second on 36, Hulme in third on 33, as they entered the final race of the year in Mexico. None of the title contenders were able to get pole, or even the front row.
Do you think the spectators get this impression of the speed? They don't see the drivers like they used to?
I don't see it matters 2 hoots, frankly. It's a lot of old coswallop that the journalists seem to write up about. Everyone talks about it. The old days are always better. But I think they're looking backwards all the time, and I think you've got to look forwards. It's there, it's a modern sport, and it's certainly mushroomed throughout the world, and the attendance figures certainly show this, and the fact that I'm asked to go and drive everywhere, all over the place, and all the other top drivers means that there's the interest there, because the people are paying to come and see it. Otherwise they couldn't afford to get us down here to watch the race. I mean, the cars are here from England, that cost them a lot of money, so the support's there, so the interest is there.
How positive a contribution do the spectators make to the sport from your point of view? Not the money, but a footballer says he's aware of a good crowd. Does it mean a lot to you?
No, you don't know them. You don't know they're there. When you're really having to go and really concentrating 100%, you just don't know there's anybody there. You don't see them. You don't notice they're there. Of course, you can't hear them. I think that's the big thing. I think a footballer isn't all that conscious of seeing them there, but there probably is in that very close compound space and ambience promoted by all these people. But I think he probably hears the noise. Well, we got quite a lot of noise here, and we got earplugs and helmets on, and we can't hear them. If they do make a noise, we can't hear them. So we're really quite on our own in a little world of our own. And the only contact we have with the outside world when the red flag drops is the pit signals.
Hill and Hulme would occupy the second row, and Jackie Stewart would start down in 7th. Hill would make a tremendous start, shooting in the lead, but not for long, as former rival John Surtees made a dive down the inside to take the lead, although Hill was able to take the lead back before the end of the first lap. Meanwhile, Stewart had also made a good start and ended the first lap battling Surtees for second place, a battle he would get the better of as he began to chase down Hill. The 2 British drivers would fight for the lead, with Stewart getting past on lap 5. Meanwhile, Hulme was not having a good final race of the season, as he sat in 4th, quite a margin behind his title rivals, and would suffer a suspension failure, which would result in a violent crash, which thankfully he walked away from uninjured, but his title hopes and his car had both gone up in smoke. This just left Hill and Stewart, Hill going for a second title, Stewart going for a first. Hill retook the lead as Joe Siffert started to catch the leading duo, and was able to pass Stewart. Hill was told from the pit lane to not fight Siffert and to focus on the pace, as Siffert was part of the Rob Walker racing team, who also used a Lotus chassis, so it would still be a Lotus win. So Siffert now took the lead of the race, although not for long, as he also had an issue which saw him return to the pit lane and give the lead back to Hill. Then, at around the halfway point of the race, one of the title contenders suffered mechanical issues, with Jackie Stewart slowing down, allowing Hill to cruise. At one point, Hill backs off so Jackie Oliver, his Lotus teammate, could unlap himself, and Oliver nearly hits Hill at the exact same point that Bandini had hit Hill 4 years previously. But Hill crossed the line, winning the race and is the 1968 Formula One World Champion, a championship he would dedicate to his friend Jim Clark.
Is there anything else in life you'd like to do?
Yeah, I'd like to live to be 100.
Much like his title win of 1962, Hill found himself feeling dissatisfied as he struggled to move past the death of Jim Clark, but also felt that Jackie Stewart was not at the best of his ability due to his broken wrist.
To have you with us tonight. Looking at racing cars, it seemed to me that they look less and less like cars to me and more like planes with these sort of aerofoil arrangements at the back here at the front. Does it mean that you're generating so much power now from the engines that in fact you've got to have this sort of arrangement, otherwise the thing is just going to take off?
Well, I personally don't generate that sort of power, but well, I have my moments, but
1969 was a hugely important year in the life of Graham Hill. It would prove to be his last at the front of the pack in Formula One, and he would turn 40 years old at the start of the year. Only Jack Brabham was older than him on the grid, and to really rub it in, his new teammate was Jochen Rindt, who at 27 years old was one of the youngest drivers on the grid. And it was the worst kept secret in the Lotus team that Rindt was there to be the next torchbearer for Lotus. The only question being, was Graham going to pass the torch, or would it be taken from him? It was all set up to be quite a personal teammate rivalry, but what many didn't expect was for Hill and Rindt to actually become quite good friends. Ultimately though, 1969 was not the year of Hill or the year of Rindt, but instead the year of Stewart, who dominated the championship and took his first world title. He took 6 wins across the year from 11 races. In fact, he won 5 of the first 6 races, and the only one he didn't win was the 3rd race of the year, the Monaco GP.
Is this race the most difficult test a Grand Prix driver has to face?
well, it's one of them, mainly because it's so tight and twisty, and there's no real straights where you can sit back and have a bit of a deep breath and think about what's going on. In fact, we're probably changing gear about 16 times a lap, so that's 1,600 gear changes, and probably work out about 1 every 5 seconds. So apart from changing gear, we've got to conduct ourselves in the car around the circuit in a proper fashion, and at the same time scan the gauges every now and then, the rev count, of course, every time you come to change gear, and eyeball all the corners. So, and as it's only 1.9 miles round, and you've got hotels, shops, trees, the sea, the quayside, nightclubs, all of which to circumnavigate, as it were, you're kept rather busy.
How much are you aware of the people and the shops and the hotels when you're going around?
Not at all. In fact, obviously you get a general sort of vista, and but you're not aware of the people. But you can. Sometimes you're looking straight at them, and you know they're there, but of course it doesn't register. I mean, it's just a kaleidoscope of colour, which of course is very attractive if you've got time to admire the view.
How far would it be true to say that Monaco's a better engineering development ground for a car than a lot of other races?
I don't know. Really, you've got to look at it first things first, and it's a spectator sport. So this is the place to come in May. It's lovely weather, it's a fantastic race, tremendous atmosphere, and that's the first thing you've got to look at. It's a tremendous race and a great one to come and watch. And if anybody's going to come and see a Grand Prix, this is really the one to go. It's such a nice place to be anyway. And then secondly, we can start thinking about development. Well, really, I think that's a sort of an offshoot, a byproduct, a bit of fallout from motor racing. And I don't think it's so important as actually putting on a damn good spectacle that everyone wants to come and see.
Jackie Stewart would take pole position that weekend. Surprisingly, it was his first pole, as well as the first pole for the Matra team, and he would get away well and keep the lead, but would suffer a mechanical fault and drop out of what had been quite a comfortable lead, giving it to the man who had previously been in second place, none other than Mr. Monaco himself, Graham Hill, who would cruise to take his 5th Monaco GP victory, where he would be joined on the podium by Joe Siffert, in 3rd for the Rob Walker Racing team, and in 2nd it was Pierce Courage, who got the first ever podium for a small independent team called the Frank Williams Racing Team.
Well, first of all, you've got to finish. Yeah. Then you've got to have a car that's capable of finishing, and then you've got to have a bit of luck.
Does it mean you've got to take it a damn sight more easier earlier on than the other boys?
I think that this is probably one of the most grueling races in the calendar for the driver and the machine. Engine, transmission, suspension, brakes, a lot, and it certainly pays to try and conserve the car and yourself if you can. But at the same time, you still want to win. So you've got a choice. Either you go flat out and try and annihilate the opposition and hope your car's going to stay in one piece, or you try and drive your own race and resist the temptation to try and keep up with them or forge ahead. You know, it's a question of really suck it and see, and I think over the years it certainly seems to pay off.
The rest of the year will be mostly uneventful for Hill, who scored points 4 times across the year, including his Monaco win. Then he got to the penultimate race of the year, at Watkins Glen. Hill was in 4th when he span out and stalled the car. He got out of the car to push it back on the track, much like he had done in Monaco all those years ago, but the new design of the cockpit meant that he was unable to refasten his seatbelts as he entered the race. Hill was returning to the pits when his tyre would shred and the car went right into a dirt bank and flipped through the air. Hill was thrown from the car at 160 miles per hour, landing directly on his knees, breaking one and dislocating the other. As he is loaded into an ambulance, he says to one of the marshals, "Please tell my wife I won't be dancing for a couple weeks." In the hospital, he asked the doctor if he can try and straighten out his left leg from his motorbike accident he'd had when he was younger, because it would make his tailor's life a hell of a lot easier. During his recovery time, he writes his first autobiography called Life at the Limit, which potentially could be the first ever F1 driver autobiography. I can't find any other examples of F1 driver autobiographies at the time, but I also can't find anything that definitively said that this was the first one. His wife Betty flies out to America to stay with him in the hospital, and this is actually the first time of their marriage they actually spent a long period of time together. Whilst in America, he is told he would never race again and would not be able to walk without the assistance of a stick. They fly him back to London to have an operation. The 4.5-hour operation took place at University College Hospital in London. They did prescribe him normal painkillers, but they had no effect on him, so instead they gave him a heavy dose of heroin, which did kill the pain. After his operation, his physio was a mix of cardio on an exercise bike, as well as swimming and weights. During this time, he still manages to keep up some of his media appearances, doing interviews, as well as being an interviewer, asking questions to Jackie Stewart at the end of the year after he became world champion.
And to interview Jackie Stewart, we've invited from hospital his friend and great rival, Graham Hill.
What particular advantage has this car got over, say, the car I was driving?
Well, it's faster, Graham.
Well, I'll buy you a drink for saying that. That's fabulous. Thank you very much. Now, have you had did you have any sort of funny moments during the year that you could talk about?
Not very many. Not very many I could talk about. But
no, neither did I. Now you come to mention that. Anyway, Jackie, I'd like to congratulate you for a fabulous season. I'd like to wish you a lot of luck for next year. Not quite as much as myself, but I hope you succeed with this new car that you're going to be driving.
Well, I wish you good fortune too, Graham.
Thank you, Jackie.
Heading into the 1970 season, Hill is told by many medical professionals that he should not race. But the accident and Hill's injury received a lot of public attention, and Hill felt under tremendous pressure from the public to fight back and get back in the car. Meanwhile, Colin Chapman assumed, as many others had, that Hill would not return, and promised the #1 role to Jochen Rindt, and gave the second Lotus seat to John Miles, who was entering his second year in F1. When Hill tells Chapman that he wants to come back, Chapman offers him a non-driving role as the team manager, but Hill turns him down, as he is coming back, and he's coming back to drive. Chapman offers him the Rob Walker Racing Team seat, which had been used by Joe Sippert the year before, so he would still be part of Lotus, but no longer in Team Lotus. Hill accepts. In practice for the South African GP, severed nerves in Graham's legs make sensitive manipulation of pedals almost impossible, and he has to just put his foot down and hope for the best, and Hill would refuse to show any sign of pain or exhaustion, especially when the cameras of the world media were around him.
Having a little trouble stopping the car, you know, my leg isn't strong enough to work the old brake too well, and so I'm having to brake fairly early, which is a bit of a disadvantage.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem to be getting too tired, and so as is the first one of the season and the one I've been aiming at, I thought I'd have a go.
The thought process of many members of the team and the media at the time was very much accepted that Graham would take part in practice to show that he could, and then gracefully bow out with his pride intact and not take part in the race or the championship and retire from motorsport. However, Graham had a different idea and continued to fight through. He would qualify 19th out of the 23 drivers, 6/10 off of John Miles in the second Lotus and 1.7 seconds behind the number 1 Lotus of Rindt. In the race itself though, remarkably, he would finish 6th to bring home 1 point. He would finish 4th in the next race in Spain and 5th in Monaco to make it 3 points finishes in a row. His qualifying seemed to be a thing that took the biggest dive from his injury, but that would lead to some rather dramatic climbs up the field, such as the British Grand Prix, where he went from 22nd to 6th. He was told by his doctors that he needed to walk more, which he hated, so to try and make it more tolerable, he took up golf and started a new club called the Formula One Drivers and Sundry Hanger-On Golf Society. Questions were being asked around Hill. He had proven to the world that he could come back, but the results were not good. 4 points finishes from 13 races, and 1970 was an incredibly tough year for him. Although his 2 points at Monaco meant that he had surpassed Fangio as the driver with the most points in F1 history, Colin Chapman refused to bring him back into Team Lotus. And then, 1970 was a year that featured a lot of deaths to some of the biggest names in the sport. Firstly, Bruce McLaren would pass away whilst testing his Can-Am car. Then just over 3 weeks later, Piers Courage would pass away after a crash at the Dutch GP. Then finally, before the Italian Grand Prix, Jochen Rindt would pass away. 1 month after his death, he was crowned world champion, the only world champion to be crowned after their death. Graham Hill never spoke publicly about any of these deaths. Going into 1971, Hill's time with Lotus came to an end, after which he was approached by the Brabham team. Jack Brabham had sold his shares of the team to Bernie Eccleston, and he approached Hill to be a driver for them in 1971. It seemed like a great move. Brabham had history competing for world titles, and they'd won a race in 1970 and got 5 podiums. Unfortunately though, it did not work out in 1971. Hill would win a race, but it was a non-championship race at Silverstone. In the official races, he would only score 2 points all year, in a car that became lovingly known as the Lobster Claw. This year was when Graham started to do more work away from the track. He would appear on This Is Your Life before the start of the season. He hosted an all-star Formula One charity cricket match and does lots of TV appearances as well as after-dinner speeches, which he is awarded Top After-Dinner Speaker by the Guild of Toastmasters. But there is more and more pressure on him to retire as he is not getting the results on the track.
Beside your undisputed skill, damn it, what single factor do you think contributed towards your victories this year?
I think again my skill. But this year perhaps more than ever before, on the streets.
I thought you did. You were certainly driving extremely well on the straights. I must agree with you there. Now, superlative skill, but you won 6 Grand Prix, which is, you know, is hogging it slightly. How do you view? I mean, there's 7 Grand Prix as the sort of record. You're obviously hoping for this. Where do you think that you could have done it and it didn't happen?
I don't think that's a fair question.
Going into 1972, Hill would stay with Brabham, but again the results would not be strong, scoring 4 points across the season Again, his qualifying would not be great, and he would have an uphill battle in the races. His biggest comeback of the year being from 27th to 11th at the USA Grand Prix, which despite the comeback would be pointless. This year he would receive an offer though, from the Matra team to compete at Le Mans. This wasn't the first time Hill had been to Le Mans. In fact, it was the 10th time Hill had attempted Le Mans. The first 5 times in a row he competed, he didn't finish the race, including an attempt in 1961 co-driving with Sterling Moss. He'd finished second twice, including in 1965, in an attempt co-driving with Jackie Stewart. It had been 6 years since Hill had been to Le Mans, but he was approached by Matra, who were backed by the French government, and they entered 4 cars, of which Hill will be driving the number 15 car with Henri Pescarolo. Pescarolo did not want Hill as a teammate, feeling he was past it, but was reassured that Hill was taking this incredibly seriously as he wanted to become the first driver to ever complete the Triple Crown. Pescarolo would start the race and would take an early lead, and it became very obvious that a Matra car was highly likely to win the race, although the question would be which Matra car, as they streaked away from the rest of the field, although there were now only 2 cars in the race, with the number 12 Matra suffering an engine fault after only the second lap, and the number 16 car suffering a transmission issue. As the sun set, the Matra cars had a 3-lap lead over the rest of the field, and they continued to swap the lead between them. In the last few hours of the race, heavy rain fell, and as the second Matra car slowed down, it would be hit and had to go to the pits for repairs, allowing Pescarolo and Hill to build the lead that they would need to safely secure the win. And just like that, Graham Hill became the first driver to secure the Triple Crown of motorsport. The Monaco GP, the Indy 500, and now the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Although Hill himself would always say that the Triple Crown was actually the Indy 500, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the Formula 1 World Championship, but either version you look at, Hill had achieved it. Although even this was overshadowed by yet another death. After the race, Hill was informed that Joe Bonnier had died in a crash. The two had been teammates at BRM during the 1960 season and had become close friends, to the point that Bonnier was the godfather of Graham's son, Damon. In 1973, Hill would make a huge change. Leaving the Brabham team, and perhaps inspired by Jack Brabham himself, he decided to set up his own team. It seemed to be the fashion at the time for drivers to establish their own teams. Not only Jack Brabham and the Brabham team, but John Surtees had started Surtees Racing Organisation in 1970, and Bruce McLaren had established McLaren in 1966. Hill's team would receive funding from the Imperial Tobacco Company, despite the fact that Hill himself didn't actually smoke, and the car would be sponsored by their Embassy Cigarettes brand, and he would get a chassis from the Shadow team, who also started their F1 team in the same year.
That's Walter Hayes, Publicity Director of Ford of Europe. You've probably read by now in the magazines and the comics that I'm going to run my own Formula 1 team. And I thought I'd like to come along and tell you what my plans are in case they're of any interest to the Ford Motor Company, and especially as I'm going to be using Ford Cosworth engines.
Yeah, well, I did actually read about it. I must confess I thought you were mad. I mean, I didn't believe it was true. It is going to happen, isn't it? Have you got a place?
Yes, we've got a workshop set up in Old Woking in Morris Gomb's place. He's very kindly let us have some workshop space there, and I have 2 excellent mechanics.
But, we just wonder, really, if you honestly have thought out just what a job you've taken on, really, because it is different. It's a hell of a challenge. I mean, you've got to be in the front office and in the back office and the stage director and the driver and the whole shooting match.
Yes, I'm beginning to find out the costs and the economics of motor racing. I reckon I'm going to spend conservatively, I suppose, about £85,000–90,000 this year.
One car? With a backup car?
Yes, I'm hoping to have a backup. If I have a backup car, then I expect that figure to be increased. So I'm hoping to have about 4 of your engines. I've got 2 brand new ones already.
So that's £30,000 to start.
Yeah, just like that.
I'm not trying to talk you out. I never tried to talk you out of anything, and even if I had, I wouldn't have succeeded. But it is a tremendous challenge to be taking on.
Hill and his team would massively struggle in their first race of the year, the Spanish Grand Prix. He qualified 22nd out of the 22 drivers, being 8.5 seconds behind Ronnie Peterson on pole in the Lotus, and 3.8 seconds off 21st place. In the race, Hill would climb out to 16th before retiring with brake issues. The Belgian GP looked like an improvement. Hill still qualified last by quite some margin, but in the race he would go from 23rd to 9th, although this was mostly due to others around him retiring, and he was lapped 5 times by eventual race winner Jackie Stewart in the Tyrrell. This would be Hill's best result of the season, and he would end the year pointless for the first time in 14 years. At the end of the 1973 season, Jackie Stewart would retire from Formula 1. Stewart had already made the decision going into the season, but after the death of his teammate Francois Sever during a practice session for the USA Grand Prix, Stewart retired 1 race earlier than expected. In his book, Hill wrote that Stewart's retirement made him feel selfish, describing Stewart as one of the finest to ever do it, and he felt that he should retire too for the sake of his family, but he was still enjoying being a racing driver despite not setting the track alight with results.
We, I use the royal we, are delighted, of course, that you retired. And I can't tell you how much we're going to miss you. I just can't tell you.
Well,
not here, anyway.
Graham, I only hope that the example that I'm giving in this direction will allow a few more to retire. And then I might sneak back in.
Now, a couple of years ago, I remember you told us that it was your sort of skill and dexterity, not to mention daring, that sort of brought you to the championship in that year. Now, is there anything you'd like to add to it for this year?
No, it's the same sort of talent that I've been able to bring out again.
Yes.
Same old stuff. I seem to remember that it was on the straight that year that I gained most.
Yes.
Well, I've been working on the corners, and this is one of the reasons that I've retired.
In 1974, the team would move to a loader chassis, and the team would bring in a second driver, Guy Edwards, for most of the year. The team would still struggle in both qualifying and the race, an average qualifying position of 19th and an average race position of 10th, which at that time gave you no points. Although the team would score their first ever points, with Hill finishing 6th at the Swedish Grand Prix, but this would be their only points of the season. A mix of these bad results and in constant pain from his injuries led to Hill becoming quite depressed, and at this time also made him very quick to anger in what was a very difficult time in Hill's life. In 1975, the car did seem to get better. Hill would finish 10th for the first race of the year and 12th in the second, although he would have a big crash in qualifying for the South African Grand Prix, which would see him miss the race, and he would also miss the next race in Spain and serve only as team manager instead of manager and driver. At the Spanish Grand Prix, the only Hill driver was the German driver Rolf Stommelen, who qualified 9th in the brand new car called the GH1. In the race, he would have a remarkable start, jumping up to 4th in a quest to get the Hills team first points of the year. Race leader James Hunt would crash, promoting Stommelen to 3rd, with John Watson in 2nd, until Watson got a puncture, promoting Stommelen to 2nd. And then new race leader Mario Andretti suffered a suspension failure, giving the lead of the race to Rolf Stommelen in the Hill car on lap 17 of 29. Suddenly, the team that hadn't scored a point all year was leading the race until lap 25 or 29, where the rear wing of the Hill car would entirely collapse and lead to a huge crash. Stommelen would survive, although he had fractured both his legs, smashed his kneecaps, cracked his ribs and broken his wrist. And the crash itself resulted in the deaths of 4 spectators and a marshal. A day that looked to be the shining moment in the Hills team history, in the blink of an eye, turned into their worst nightmare. Graham Hill had now been batting away questions of retirement for over 5 years, and was even now questioning it himself after scoring 1 point between 1973 and 1975. And now, spending more and more time working on the team, it seemed like retirement would come very soon. But Hill wanted to end his career on a high rather than on a fault, and up next was the track that had given him the most highs in his career, Monte Carlo. One last piece of Monaco magic from Mr. Monaco. In qualifying, 26 cars entered the race, but only the top 18 would actually start. Niki Lauda took pole in his Ferrari, with Tom Price alongside him in second in the shadow, just under 7 tenths behind. Meanwhile, Graham Hill suffered an engine failure and was 3 seconds off the pace, and finished qualifying in 21st place, meaning he had failed to qualify for the Monaco GP. This was the first and only time Graham Hill failed to qualify for a race in Formula 1, and after this, Hill decided it was time to call it a day. After his retirement, Hill did seem to return to his former self, in a much better mood without the pressure of living up to his past self. At the British Grand Prix, he would receive a lap of honour around Silverstone to say goodbye to the British fans, which he completes whilst trying to hold back tears. As well as being the manager for his team, he was now coaching young driver Tony Bryce. The 23-year-old was the youngest driver on the grid and the newest member of Hill's team, and seemed to have immense talent, scoring Hill's first points of the year at the Swedish Grand Prix, finishing 6th. Future world champion Alan Jones would also briefly join the team, and got the team's best ever finishing result with a 5th at the German Grand Prix. The team started work on the GH2, and initial testing times looked very positive. Hill wrote that his biggest regret in his career was that he did not spend enough time with his children, and says that he absolutely adores them. He talks about the effect his fame has had on his children, saying his 2 daughters, Samantha and Bridget, both had phases where they would proudly proclaim that their father was Graham Hill, the racing driver, whereas Damon didn't want to be known as Graham Hill's son. He wanted to be known as Damon Hill. He was very proud of his father and loved it when he won races, but wanted to be his own person. On top of that, neither Graham or Betty wanted Damon to become a motor racing driver, with Graham Hill writing, "I can't believe any parent wants their son to become a motor racing driver. I think Damon is far too intelligent for that." Hill also takes road safety incredibly seriously and does a series of programs and a book called Advanced Driving with Graham Hill. He also writes that he believes autonomous driving will be possible by the year 2000, and he has an interest in renewable energies, especially solar energy, and even tested on an electric bike with Prince Charles, and campaigns heavily with the Disabled Driver Association for safe cars for disabled people. After the season ended, the Embassy Hill team would go to Paul Ricard to test the GH2. After another successful test, the team flew back to the UK in Hill's plane with Graham flying. Flying over London, visibility was low due to fog. The plane would clip the treetops surrounding the Arkley Golf Club. The plane would hit more trees and then strike the ground and ignite. Those on the plane were Graham Hill, team manager Ray Brimble, designer Andy Smallman, mechanics Terry Richard and Tony Alcock, and racing driver Tony Bryce. All of them would die immediately. Hill's pilot license was not up to date when the crash happened, meaning insurance would not pay out, and the families of those who had died sued the Hill estate, which would take the majority of the money Hill had left to his family. The Hill racing team now only had 3 living members, and the team was disbanded. Hill's funeral would take place at St Albans Abbey. Before he died, he was writing his second autobiography, which he called Graham. It was published a year after his death, and in a strange twist of fate, he finished writing the book days before his death, and the last thing he wrote was this: "You know the risks, you accept them. If man can't look at danger and still go on, man has stopped living. If the worst ever happens, then it means simply I've been asked to pay the bill for the happiness of my life without a moment's regret." When Graham Hill died, he sat 5th all-time for F1 wins. He was number 1 for most Grand Prix, a record that wouldn't be broken for another 11 years. He was 2nd all-time for points scored behind his friend Jackie Stewart, and he had been the man who had broken Fangio's 277-point record. A Formula 1 career that had started alongside the likes of Juan Manuel Fangio, and had battled for world titles with Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, John Surtees and Denny Hulme, and ended alongside the likes of Niki Lauda and James Hunt. But of course, the Hill legacy in Formula 1 would not be over. But that is a story for another time.
And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.